Hi, welcome back to the podcast School of Love, where we want to help you create parent-child relationships where you can talk about anything, especially about sex. But what if you have big things in your past that hinder you from having those conversations because you don't want to pass on something that you experienced and the feelings behind that? It might not only be sex, but sometimes we have trauma in many different areas in our lives. Today, my guest, he accompanies me in explaining different kinds of trauma. There's big trauma and then there's very subtle trauma. And both of them are very important to work on. And so I hope from this podcast you can gain not only tools in processing your own trauma if you need to, but also see how valuable this is for your family when you go through these not so easy steps of processing. So thank you so much for coming, and I hope this is a great podcast for you. I know I also learned a lot through this, so enjoy. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to School of Love. And I'm here with Phillip Schanker. I'll just give you a little history about Phillip Schanker in case you haven't heard of him yet or not enough of him. So he joined the unification movement in California in 1972 at the age of 18. He was blessed in 1982, has 4 adult children and 2 grandchildren. And he served the Unification Church and later the Family Federation in the USA as Director of Public Affairs and National Director of Education, and spent 5 years as National Director of the Blessed Family Ministry. He worked as a missionary, educating youth in cooperation with the governments of Zambia and the Philippines, and he spent the last 10 years as a therapist, counselor, and coach, working online with clients around the world. So welcome, Phillip. Really nice to
Thank you. It's really nice to be here.
And where do you live right now?
I'm actually living in Guadalajara, Mexico, outside of Guadalajara.
Wow. Is it a pretty place?
It is an affordable place. It is a beautiful place. And from here, I can access children and grandchildren around the world. It's a lovely place.
Most important.
Yeah. And of course, I meet my clients online. So I have clients in Asia, Middle East, South America, everywhere. So it's very convenient and useful.
Nice. And how old are those 2 little grandchildren?
10 and 8.
Oh, they're not too little.
Yeah, no, not too little, but there looks like there are others on the way. Finally, I won't say more. Yeah. There's something special about the grandparents' realm of heart. It's very, very special. So I'm appreciating that in this, my 70th year.
That's so wonderful because I also think that's so great. Like as a parent, I really value grandparents. And then also, but I see some grandparents, they don't know their own value, and or they just don't enjoy it as much as they could be. Yeah, there are also sometimes physical limitations, body-wise or time and space. I'm glad to hear you're really enjoying that part of your life.
Yeah, and actually, because I'm now for the rest of my journey on this earth, I'm experiencing a blended family with my partner. And so actually together, we're talking about 8 children and 6 grandchildren on 3 continents. So that's one reason why from here we can access everybody. And it's the role of grandparents and those 3 generations it's just inexplicable how profound and important. And it's also great to be in a position of sharing wisdom and experience and a special kind of love that can feel very unconditional for children from grandparents, and not at the same time having to deal with all of the challenges of parenthood. And that's also one reason why this whole topic of maintaining healthy and healed relationships between the generations is very important.
Mm-hmm. That's cool. I'm excited to be a grandparent now. So today we want to talk about processing our own trauma as a parent. So we can really do it better for our own children and hopefully not pass on whatever we experienced. Maybe we can just start with the basics. What is trauma? How does it affect our lives?
That's a really actually important question because most people misunderstand. But we think of trauma, and of course the term comes from physical, medical trauma. And it was first defined as wounds, hurts, broken arms, things that happen to us physically. That became translated to the realm of psychology. And again, we thought of trauma as what happens to us. And everybody thinks that trauma is big stuff like living through a war or being sexually abused, or which are huge and impactful and serious. But there's two important distinctions that we need to make and are being made by professionals. One is that trauma is not necessarily what happens to us, but what happens within us as a response to what happens to us. Because there are whole physiological and neurobiological systems that are activated when we're under threat, when we're in danger, when we don't feel safe, when we feel threatened, and that can be an emotional threat, and your brain and body don't necessarily know the difference between if a tiger is trying to eat you or if someone is diminishing your sense of value or making you feel like you have to be what they want you to be, these kinds of things. So it's not just what happens to us, but what happens within us. And that can be different for every person. For example, two people lived through concentration camp of Auschwitz and experienced the worst unbelievable horrors. One of them comes out as a champion for the world, writes books, reconciles, Jews and non-Jews, and the other is crushed and destroyed and depressed and becomes alcoholic. Right? And that has a lot to do with resiliency, because some degree of challenge and pressure in life is natural and it builds resiliency. So it can also be a problem when we as parents make things too easy for our kids, try to remove challenges from them, and when someone lacks resiliency, things overwhelm me, I feel I can't deal with this, and then we start to compare ourselves to other people, it's useless. Because the younger you are when hurts occur, the less able you are by design to solve the problem yourself. A baby can't climb out of the crib and make himself a sandwich when he's hungry. And so the cry and the response of parents is the way that child regulates and feels confident that he can regulate. So when early trauma occurs, sometimes stuff before we know how to speak and stuff we can't remember, then later in life, it's easy to feel like, I don't know what to do. I can't solve this. I need somebody to do it for me. All of these things are unique to the individual. And the last thing I want to say about that is that kind of dramatic, overwhelming occurrences that I referred to, abuse and neglect and abandonment, that's big T trauma. And that's about 10% of trauma that human beings experience. 90% of trauma is with a little t. And that's rather than being electrocuted in a moment, it's like death by 1,000 cuts. It's the daily process of needing to reshape myself or diminish or control or suppress my emotions in order not to provoke anger or to be told I'm a bad religious kid or I haven't done this right. It's very subtle and small things that take place over time that also cause us to feel like we need to behave or act differently and to lose touch with our authentic selves. And it also doesn't mean that those who contribute to that experience are bad or evil or wrong. Many times it's unintentional. A parent who devotes themselves to mission work and isn't present for their child. And we have experiences like this in the history of the unification community, where for the very best and most noble of reasons, people sacrificed themselves for the sake of the higher good. But a child doesn't necessarily experience it that way. And so these are the kinds of things. And another term for little t trauma is it's called complex trauma or complex PTSD. But it's essentially attachment wounding. It's the wounds that we experience in attachment relationships that are the legacy of the fall, that there is no one who can experience unconditional love in a perfect world. We all experience some degree of attachment wounding.
Yeah, I can really just resonate with that, not because I feel like I went through this or anything, but I I think young kids, they, like you said, what happens within us is
Mhm.
now becoming recognized as trauma. Yeah, like, would you say that's also kind of like accumulating beliefs, whether they're true or not? Like a child then is in a situation and then maybe feels put down and they develop a belief within themselves.
That's a really good point, a really good question, and a really good point. Because I think in my practice, what I've learned is that during that pre adolescent period where we are vulnerable and dependent, and attachment, let me just for a second talk about attachment. From an evolutionary standpoint, it is up until mammals, reptiles, there's no attachment. The lizard is hatched, there's no parents, there's no protection. There were 100 of them hatched, so 3 of them are going to survive. But once you come to the mammal world, parenting, protection, safety, groups, connection. If I'm not attached, I'm dead. Now, in human beings, no existence that we know of is born more vulnerable and takes a longer period of time to be able to survive on its own. In other words, the need for parental caregiving and protection and safety is more intense than in any other species. And of course, from a spiritual point of view, that's the school of love, the very title of your organization and podcast. We're not designed to learn about God in monasteries and mountaintops. Develop our heart. And this 4 realms of the experience of heart is actually a beautiful developmental theory, because the child's realm of heart, it's not about learning to be loyal as I was taught, learning to be faithful as I was taught. It's not about the responsibilities of the child. It's about learning the child realizing his or her value. We don't learn how to love ourselves by self-care and spa days, right? We actually are meant to learn we're valuable because we're loved and safe in that first period. And for many of us, that's a missed or limited developmental need, because your own self-worth is the basis of then the next stage, being able to cooperate and love without jealousy. And of course, in the process of growing, you start selfishly, right? And that whole process is learning how to expand our capacity of love. And so in that first developmental period, when we learn our value, when that is invaded or missing or limited, when there's some hurts, as you said, it affects, first of all, how we see ourselves in the world. And we can develop false beliefs about whether I can trust others. If anybody knew who I really was, they wouldn't like me because I'm a piece of garbage on the inside. And because children are desperate for attachment, when there's something missing, when there's a flaw or a limitation on the part of a parent, the child doesn't automatically conclude, my parents messed up. It's his problem. Automatically, not only does a child believe, but he needs to believe it's my fault. It must be me. I'm the one that's the problem. Because if my caregivers are flawed, I'm not safe. I'm dead. And so we need to see parents as God. The younger we are, the more we think my parents can answer all my questions. My parents are the model. I want to be like them. I want to live like them. And a big part of attachment wounding is when we learn they aren't all that. And there's a rebellion and an anger. I can't tell you how many times parents came to me and said, my child was just perfect and obedient. They just did everything until they were 12 or 13. And all of a sudden, because of the wrong friends, they started acting up in rebellion. No, the roots of that go way, 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 way deep. So, organizations like yours and podcasts like this are super valuable to be aware, not to blame ourselves, not to blame our parents, right? That you don't heal by blaming others or by giving others the power to decide who you are, or you know. So, but it's so important to be aware of these things. So yeah, false beliefs is one aspect. Another aspect is the hurts in the heart, and therefore the emotional confusion and struggle that we experience, the lack of self-worth, the sense of shame that I'm less than, I'm not enough of a person, I'm not enough of a blessed child, I'm not enough, I'm less of a man, I'm less. And that's at the root of so many of the worst things we do, is our insecurity and fear and doubt. So the emotional impact and the cognitive impact, as you referred to, the false beliefs. And there are ways of working on both those things.
This is really, really fascinating and really good. And I love that you said, yeah, we won't heal by blaming. So, yeah, and what we want to do is, I feel like we want to heal to get better for those kids that we have, right? Because, like, that's what, like, I keep thinking, like, I know my parents weren't perfect, but I can look back and know, yeah, they came from their parents who were also not perfect.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be perfect either, but I can try to improve this and that and give my kids a little bit of a better chance to have less trauma or just less false beliefs.
If I can also say, we also don't heal by just jumping to forgiveness without letting that wounded child, who is at the base of our self identity, that inner child we talk about, is just a framework to access the self identity and self worth that is at the core of our who we are, our identity, that was formed during that child's realm, that vulnerable period. And we do need to let that hurt be expressed, validated, and heard. And one problem for parents and others is that we feel attacked, or we feel blamed, or we feel like, oh, you're saying it's my fault. And then to defend ourselves and to protect ourselves, we aren't able to give the space and safety for that hurt to be expressed, heard, healed. And then the child can grow up into an adult who's able to forgive and take responsibility for themselves. It's a very specific process. And that's a big part of what I do, is try to help that process with individuals and with family.
Wonderful. And so you mentioned that 90% of trauma is mini trauma with a small t, and 10% is capital T trauma, like the big things that we generally think of as trauma. So what causes this? I don't know. I don't want to call them mini traumas because they're just, you said death by 1,000 cuts. They're probably just as painful as even the big ones,
Yeah.
if it's repetitively bringing you down. So yeah, what causes these small t traumas, and how is it different from the capital T
Yeah.
trauma?
It's also a really good question. And essentially, as I said, when they're talking about small t trauma, because most people will think, well, I'm functioning in the world. I'm a good parent. I don't want to dig into my past, or I forget that past. I don't want to go back to the pain, or I don't want to go back to my anger. Let me just go forward. Small t, or basically attachment wounding, is something that, as I said, is a legacy of the fact that if you look in Scripture, look in the Garden of Eden, we're talking about a dysfunctional family. Parents that weren't united, that were separated from God, became centered on themselves, then began to blame each other, and couldn't be a channel of unconditional love to their children, who, because there wasn't enough love, blamed, were jealous, and ultimately hurt each other and killed, one killed the other. And that's the root and the legacy of the family experience, which, of course, family is super important, family is super beautiful, but it's not perfect for anyone. Nobody, no family, however religious, however harmonious, however sincere, escapes some degree of attachment wounding. And so the small t trauma, or attachment wounds, I would divide them into two categories. One is lack of attachment, which is like neglect or abandonment. And an obvious example of that would be if it's a big T trauma, parents leave their kid in a basket in front of the hospital, right? Or parents are drug addicted and can't take care of their kids. But this also happens when a parent dies. We can experience abandonment. This can happen when parents split up and I'm raised by one and I feel detached from the other. This can happen when I suddenly discover that I was adopted and I was an offering a child when I was a kid and I didn't know that, and I don't even belong to this family. And these kinds of emotional things create that kind of basis for attachment wounding. This can happen when a parent is devoted to their mission or their job and not physically present, or their way of dealing with their painful past has been to withdraw and not be available emotionally. I've heard stories of, my dad would be there in the living room with us, but in his computer and never having anything to do with what was going on. And these are the small t, because again, they still impact how we learn to adapt and how we learn to deal. And we make changes that disconnect us from our authentic selves. And there's a big difference between being a natural introvert, which is a trait, and being emotionally withdrawn because I don't want to be hurt, that is an example of learned behavior from trauma. The other category of trauma is unhealthy relationships or unhealthy attachment. And an obvious example of that are the big four capital T traumas: emotional abuse, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse. Those are big T obvious ones. But this can be a parent that's overly critical, that I never feel I'm good enough. This can be the expectation of what it means to be a blessed child, and I can never live up to it. This can be all different kinds of situations, anger, or a parent that's unstable, or because of volatile, I'll use that word, or because of their own emotional hurts and needs, put their emotional needs on their kids, live through their kids, seek their kids to fill the empty place because their marriage isn't working well. Lots of different ways that these kind of things can happen. So those are the way more common kinds of traumas that people experience.
Mm. Yeah.
If that's a clear answer to your question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So maybe some people have either big T or small T trauma. Yeah. Like I can imagine some people think like, I don't want to complain, I don't want to really bring this up. But yeah, why do you think it's worth going back and digging that out of the closet or, facing those things?
Well, really good. Again, I love the question. And first, let me mention, and I hope everybody who has an opportunity to hear this will look at their own situation. There are 5 major areas that I've discovered over time and learned from experts, the ways in which trauma, big or little, impacts our lives. And it's basically every area that human beings struggle in has a relationship with traumatic attachment experiences, painful attachment experiences. The first area is our emotional health on the inside. So if you're experiencing a deep lack of self-worth, lack of self-confidence, or a deep sense of shame around sexuality, around who you are, around everybody else is successful and my life is so far behind, or if you experience insecurity and fear, lots of anxiety, and it's difficult for you to deal with situations, or you find yourself speaking things that you don't really want to, and you're saying stuff because of emotional reasons, or saying things or if you find yourself wondering who you are and where your life is going, and you've lost touch with who you really are, that's the emotional area that is impacted by trauma. And it's a good sign that you should investigate, take a look at the roots. The second area that human beings are impacted is with compulsive behaviors, which is a huge problem all over the world right now, right? And the reason trauma impacts compulsive behavior is because what human beings have learned to do is to take the emotional needs, the healthy emotional needs that have never been met in healthy ways, or the emotional hurts that we haven't healed, and we attach them to pleasure. We try to take the inner need for connection, meaning, being seen, being loved, being valued, which is a spiritual, ethereal, internal. It's a feeling in the soul that lasts and supports your life. When we're not experiencing that, we take the needs that haven't been met or the hurts that haven't been healed, and we try to medicate them or imitate them with pleasure. But pleasure's in the body. Pleasure's temporary. Pleasure doesn't last. Pleasure, even when you're doing it with another person, the pleasure part is self-centered. It's only my experience, right? Sexuality between two people, the physical aspect is personal pleasure, but when there's a sharing and a love and a service and a healing and a way of express, then it becomes a different kind of experience. There's a very big difference between self-centered sex, which is just the physical, just by myself, and partner sex, right? It's very different. It's two different worlds, actually. What human beings do is take the need for happiness and fulfillment and contentment and try to replace it with pleasure. Both are important, but this one can't fill this one. So and the number one way people do that is with food, because it's the most accessible, right? We eat our feelings, we have compulsive relationships with food, all kinds of things. Second is sex, because it's also, I'm carrying it around between my legs. It's with me. The machinery is with me. I can access it easily. And when sex becomes a compulsive way of trying to imitate, we visualize or fantasize what we want to be or haven't experienced, and then we punctuate it with a moment of pleasure, or we medicate our pain through that. So food and sex are most common, right? And then comes substances, drugs, alcohol, and now behaviors like social media and internet computer games, which can create that pleasure feeling of dopamine and oxytocin and connection. People go on social media and feel like they're connecting to people and they're important. And so this is the second area. If you are dealing with compulsive behavior, something you don't want to do, but you can't stop doing it, it can help to not just try and change and discipline and report and be accountable, but to dig into the roots of the emotional hurts and needs. Third area that attachment wounding affects us is in our relationships with others, because unhealthy attachment experiences cause a lack of ability to create boundaries, to know where I end and other people begin, which means I'm always thinking that I'm defined by what other people think of me, and I'm worried what they're saying and doing behind my back. And, we try to resolve these things by a good religious life. That's a good thing, to be valued in the eyes of God and not to worry about the eyes of men. It's a great spiritual principle, but sometimes some emotional work will help get to that place. So the problems in relationships are the third area, attachment experiences. And people think, I married the wrong partner, they divorce them, but the pattern continues. It will continue until I heal the wounds myself. People think, I'm not satisfied in this relationship. She doesn't see me. He puts me down. So let me go have sex with someone else who has the advantage of not knowing who I really am, not knowing all my garbage. And we share this moment, but it doesn't solve anything, heal anything, resolve anything. But this is what human beings do rather than heal the roots. The fourth area is our physical health. The absolute fact. It doesn't mean, it's very important not to start feeling like I'm the cause of my disease, it's my fault, or to judge other people for their physical challenges. But it is very important to know that because emotions produce specific substances, neuropeptides and hormones that go into the body and impact us, then now in the United States, it's estimated that 70% of disease is emotional stress, anxiety, and internal struggle related. It's one important factor. And the fifth area, and this was my big discovery, fifth way in which childhood wounds impact adult life, this is a huge one, is mental health issues. You know, you talk to the medical profession or the psychiatric profession, they will tell you you have a mental health issue. And I'm talking about the most common ones, like anxiety, like depression, like overthinking, like obsessive and compulsive behaviors, like ups and downs that become bipolar. The medical profession will tell you it's changing now. But traditionally it was, well, this is brain-based and hereditary. So here's what we do. We give you a synthetic medication to rebalance the dopamine and serotonin relationship in your brain to affect your mood. That is like a cast on a broken arm. That's temporary to deal with symptoms. It does not deal with the root. And who should be living with lifetime medications? I mean, there are hereditary factors, so I want to qualify that. Of course, there are I'm taking medication as a result of my heart attack some years ago, 6 years ago. So I don't mean to diss that, but when people are taking synthetic medications for mood-related and inner struggle-related issues, that's important. I'm not diagnosing anything different. However, to work on the deeper roots, because these kinds of mental health issues are coming from adaptive behaviors in childhood. For example, when my parents are strong, emotional, aggressive, or I'm told I'm a bad unificationist or a bad Catholic if I get angry, or I'm punished for these things, one byproduct is I learn to suppress my feelings or withdraw or hold those things down. And that depression, get it, is part of the root of, because you can't just push down the bad ones and keep feeling the good ones. There's only a master volume switch. You can't turn down the negatives and keep the positives. It affects how you relate with the world emotionally. Anxiety, there's a part that's mental, there's a part that's overthinking, and that there's ways of working with that, but there's a part that can be feeling unsafe experientially, feeling the fight, flight, or freeze response because I feel unsafe, unprotected, alone, or threatened. And that can be very subtle. So these 5 areas all can be addressed by dealing with attachment hurts and resolving that. And you asked, why should I? Very important, because if you don't, whatever's not resolved is passed on. It is just an absolute fact. And I'll give you 3 points of proof for that, 2 of them biblical and 1 of them scientific. Of course, there is the story of Abraham and Isaac, and what Abraham was tasked with in his life as part of his path and journey and responsibility. What he didn't do was exactly remaining there for his son to go through the same path. And several places in the Bible, it makes clear that the sins or iniquities of the fathers are visited upon the children to the 3rd and 4th generations. Now, this doesn't mean God curses or punishes. Well, look what your parents did. I'm going to punish you. And in fact, Scripture says that doesn't take place. God doesn't punish for the sins of fathers or fathers for the sins of sons. So what is it that's passed on? It's unresolved stuff. It's unresolved stuff. And amazing, 50 years ago comes the epigenetic field of science, realizing the genes actually turn on and turn off and are involved in the way we live and in everything. And it's now understood that trauma can pass through up to 3 generations. We are impacted. And we know there's such a thing as predispositions that you inherit. We inherit the good stuff, the foundation of who we are as people, and we inherit the bad as well. So what you don't how many times have you seen people that say, when I grow up, I'm never going to do to my kids what my parents did to me? If you don't deal with your stuff, you will do the same thing. It's going to be a repeating pattern. And I see it all the time in families that I work with, right? All the women in a certain family divorced, or sexual abuse generation after generation, or this or that issue that continues until it's resolved. And often the more sensitive child feels all of these things and therefore is struggling more than maybe other siblings or others like that. That was a lot, but I warned you it would be like that.
No, it's really fascinating, and I love how you also broke down the fact that this is not God punishing us, but we're just dealing with stuff. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it, it all came from one point, which was the fall, and we all are coming from this broken family. And yeah, I think like if I just think of myself, it usually is if I there's something uncomfortable, that's where I need to go, to really grow. In the past, it's like, oh, I'm going to avoid that. I'll stay in this comfort zone. But yeah, when we really want to grow, we face those things. And then I really feel like it's so inspiring then for our kids to be liberated of that, at least a little bit. I mean,
It's
I
probably
don't
the
know.
best the best thing you can do for your children is work on your own stuff. Even just setting that example, because there are huge numbers of people all over the world that stay in their comfort zone, that do what's comfortable and avoid what's uncomfortable, and that rut becomes a grave. As we get older and we don't challenge ourselves. I mean, Father used to say, you should experience different cultures, different countries. You should live in those things, eat those foods, deal with other values, broaden yourself, challenge yourself. There's so many people that as they reach old age have remained within that comfort zone, and the difficulties are and regret is there, lots of difficult emotional struggles, and sometimes I don't want to go too far, but sometimes you can see on someone's face as they get older how, and again, it's not to judge anybody, but you can see the burdens and the people's
Mhm.
face becomes like this as they get older. So it's a really great. I love to hear you say that like if I feel something that's uncomfortable or challenging, that's where I need to go and need to focus. And it's a great example for our kids, just that.
Mm. Yeah. So say we recognize there's something now, I, I know I need to work on this. So how can someone make that first step? And yeah, and also I think it's a big decision. Who do I go to with my trauma? Not only, yeah, like what kind of therapist, but how do I really get a good feeling of, do I feel comfortable with this person? Can I trust them?
Oh, it's a really good question. I don't necessarily recommend that a person needs to start with therapy, although I consider therapy, like I said, many people think therapy is for the weak, the wounded, the broken, people who can't live. And lots of people turn to therapy when they can't live their lives. The integrity gap between their dreams, values, and desires and how they want to live and what they're able to do is so wide that they can't continue existing, right? They can't continue just pretending or shoving stuff under the carpet but there are so many great resources for, some of the most important things I feel. And there are great books and great programs and great tools that are available. And if, I think you probably have a ton of resources, but one, you talked about the false beliefs, and the most effective therapeutic process to deal with unhealthy beliefs and learn how to change how I feel by changing how I think. That's cognitive therapy. And cognitive therapy is statistically the most effective form of therapy. And I believe that's because it's a little easier than changing my emotion, than dealing with emotional hurts in a direct way. And therefore, I don't think cognitive therapy is the total answer to everything, but it's a very effective way of addressing cognitive therapists. And there are many kinds, the cognitive behavioral, there are many kinds. And it's a good idea when you're approaching a therapist that you want to make sure that they are in alignment with your values. For example, you want to see a marital therapist. You want to make sure that they are advocates of committed relationships and not going to jump to divorce as a solution to things. That they're going to share if that's your values, that they're aligned with your values. If you're going to see a therapist about gender confusion and sexual issues, which a lot of people reach out to me for that. You want to make sure how they see it. Are they in the position that, well, the reason you're stressed, the reason you're struggling, the reason you're suffering is because you just have to accept that you are not, of the gender you were born. You are different. And that if that's their approach and that's not your approach, then that may not be the person that you want to see. When you want to make sure about your religious values, that they will respect and understand and work with, which more and more therapists are able now not to just be materialist and hardwired in science and medicine. Many are more able to work with a person's value framework. But those are the kinds of things you want to make sure of. And if you're talking about, so there are great books. I'm looking at my bookshelf over here. Mind Over Mood is it's a great book, filled with all kinds of cognitive strategies that you can apply on your own. The one I use is a classic. When I use with my clients, I take my clients through it as a workbook, is 10 Days to Self-Esteem. And it's not about self-esteem for me, even though that's a byproduct, but it's about learning some simple cognitive techniques to address unhealthy thinking, to recognize false beliefs, and to change the beliefs in order to change my feeling. Cognitive therapy is a good place to start. And there are seminars, there are actually people who suffered from anxiety and depression have themselves, they're not necessarily professionals, but I know of 2 programs. I'm trying to remember the name of them. You'll have to get them from me later, where these individuals put together a cognitive program, a 2 or 3 week program of practicing and rehearsing to change how I'm looking at the world internally. The other one is a 6-month program, and to apply a healthier way of thinking. These are good tools to deal with emotional hurts that have affected how I feel and how I react. Oh, and let me digress for a second. Another good evidence that some good ways to recognize that I might need to look deeper within myself is, number one, if I experience intense emotional triggering. If situations trigger me to feel angry, to react, to get freaked out, to get upset, to feel deeply hurt, to get depressed, a trigger is what that means is that somebody is touching a sensitive place, a wound. When you touch a physical wound, it hurts. The same thing is happening when a situation triggers emotional sensitivity or reactiveness. And well, I talked about a lot of the other ways to recognize that you need to do some work. But working on the emotional stuff, I find that inner child work, which I referred to before, is a really, really helpful way. And it's not just some woo-woo new age idea that there's a little kid within you. It's based on the understanding of Carl Jung that a huge part of our inner self is subconscious. It's beneath our awareness, especially painful things. We put them where they don't hurt, outside of what we're aware of. And so we're not dealing with them on a daily basis. But in that subconscious, a large part of that is the self identity that was formed during childhood, during that vulnerable period. And inner child work is a way to access that, to get more in touch with what I really feel, and to learn how to resolve and to be more compassionate and loving with myself, which if I can't do that, how can I be compassionate and loving toward other people? So these are some tools, and there are lots of good tools. Some of the guests you've had on podcasts, I know Myrna LaPrence, a lot of these guys are leading online courses on inner child work and on other healthy approaches inner life. So I hope I've dealt with both how to find a good therapist, and of course, um, I specialize. I'm not looking for therapy clients. I have a lot, but a therapist that is more eclectic and able to work with all of these things. One last area. There's a whole bunch of good areas, but neurobiological techniques are also extremely helpful. Breathing, diaphragmatic breathing is more powerful. It's been statistically peer reviewed proven that diaphragmatic breathing is more powerful than anti-anxiety medication because it directly turns off, and there are other neurobiological things. Walking, Abraham Lincoln and many of the Stoic philosophers walked in order to calm themselves, to think deeply, because walking is a left-right brain activity which has an effect on your sympathetic nervous system, which turns on the stress response, and more importantly, it initiates your parasympathetic nervous system, which turns off the stress response, calms you, lowers your heart rate, allows you to think more clearly, brings down your blood pressure. And so these are real substantial things and tools that can be used. Lots of YouTubes, lots of great stuff on that. And if you want more resources from me, I can give them to you later. Does that answer your question?
It does. It answers it. And I like how you suggested to find a therapist that someone should really, yeah, feel
That's
like
in alignment with values, spirituality, your beliefs and sense of, and what you're looking for is very important. Very important.
yeah.
And there are, I know on the, can't remember the website, but when I was Blessed Family Ministry Director, we developed a website with these kind of resources. Like, what questions should you ask if you're going into marital therapy? What should you ask of your therapist? But it's very important to make sure that that person's in alignment. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good to know. And so you mentioned some therapy types. I don't honestly know so much about therapy. So you mentioned cognitive therapy. What I understood from what you said, it's like kind of rewiring the thoughts that I generally have and putting in the ones that I wish to have. Is it
Yeah.
kind of like that? It's a thought
Cognitive
process.
therapy is very effective and it focuses on unhealthy thinking, recognizing anxiety, for example. Anxiety is most commonly a combination of the unsafe feeling that creates a sense of vulnerability and stimulates the stress response. And so there's a feeling of unsafety and anxiety, unhealthy thinking. So if I feel unsafe, then what's wrong? Well, what if people think this about me? What if that? What might happen in the future? What if this is going to? Anxiety is usually about what's coming, usually about the future, and it takes you out of the presence. So even mindfulness, which brings you to be in the moment, is a useful tool to address anxiety, which brings you out of being in the moment and brings you to the future. Depression and regret bring you to the past. They have you focusing on, oh, I wish I hadn't done that, and why did that happen to me? And you're not, just being in the present can solve a lot of these things. So when I work in therapy, I use all of these tools in an eclectic fashion. I try to identify with the people I'm working with what are the areas of wounding that we agree upon, that we recognize, help the client recognize that these are real issues. Because another thing about hurts is we tend to deny them. We tend to deny them. I can't tell you how many people have come to me and said, no, my parents were amazing. And it was all great and they were so good. And I had a wonderful childhood. And later I find out that, and it's often very subtle. So yeah, so you're right about cognitive therapy. It deals with thinking. And it's a very effective tool for things like anxiety and overthinking. And the simple way to understand cognitive therapy is it's ABC. A is activating event. Something happens to us. C is consequential feeling. Something happens to us, we feel badly. Somebody dissed me. I didn't get chosen on the team. Somebody said something or looked at me the wrong way, and I feel badly. What cognitive therapy does is examine beliefs, how your way of believing and how you're mentioned neural pathways, the way you've learned to think and see the world. And these are all changeable now. We now understand the brain is neuroplastic, not just when you're a child, but all throughout life. You can change the way you think, right? And there are lots of tools for that. So, what was that? Yeah. So dealing with, I completely forgot where I was, but
Cognitive.
it's all good stuff. Yeah, cognitive therapy. So dealing with the thank you, dealing with the belief system. And by learning techniques of recognizing false beliefs, such as black and white thinking. Oh my gosh, I'm not good with, I'm in this internet meeting and everybody's talking about politics and I can't relate to politics, so I'm a stupid person. You know, Einstein said if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, the fish is going to grow up thinking it's stupid and incapable, because Einstein was kicked out of school and flunked and because he couldn't relate to the way knowledge was taught. His brain was inspirational. He worked in a different way. He didn't fit. So I'm starting to get a little digressive here, but yeah, cognitive therapy is good for that. Psychodynamic therapy, processing memories, because you can't change the past. You can't change people that might have hurt you or affected your life negatively. But when you go back to memories and you allow those feelings to come up and you process through them and you are heard and understood by someone around something that you couldn't share with anybody, that heals. And secondly, if you stand up and speak up for yourself, or your adult self there stands up for that child, it doesn't change anything except you on the inside. And a lot of times we try to change behavior. Oh, this is important. Good therapy involves two important things: pulling weeds and planting seeds. Planting seeds, positive psychology, and many other approaches are all about creating new healthy behaviors. That's a good thing. But sometimes it's difficult to do that because we already have deeply ingrained patterns. We already have neurobiological pathways and habits. And that's when going down to the roots of the unhealthy behaviors and pulling them out can be helpful. So both elements are part of good therapy.
Yeah, I just want to mention, like I heard once, I don't know how true it is, that the thoughts we have each day, we have, I don't know, 80,000, and 60,000 are repeated again and again and again every day. And when I heard that, I was like, I really could think like, wow, I think that's true for myself. And what a waste. Such a waste of space and time and energy. And yeah, I looked up some therapists online, and I realized the power of affirmations. And I started just doing some little things like every little fear or negative belief of myself, I turned it around and I recorded my voice saying it in a positive way. Like, I can do this, I am confident, or something like that. And I just listened to myself say these recordings. And yeah, I just really can appreciate the power of that. Like, because you said we don't always necessarily need to go deep into therapy. And I think, yeah, it's really inspiring to know these tools and how much impact they can have.
Yeah. And that's one of the tools I use with my clients, right? Because the fact is, thoughts are electric. And this is really a little bit my simple explanations. Somebody could criticize it for being unscientific, but it's essentially true. Thoughts are electric because a thought is a synapse firing, and the firing fires the next synapse, and a circuit is created, and it is a form of energy and electricity. And feelings are chemical. Now, feelings also can be creating neural pathways. They're also a type of thought, but feelings also, every experience produces feelings, and every feeling produces a stream of neuropeptides and hormones. The hormones of stress are adrenaline and cortisol. And these go into the brain, they go into the body, and so that's why emotions impact health. It's not mystical. It's very concrete. And why, 50 years ago, when affirmations were introduced, that if you repeat something over and over again or put it on as you sleep, the terminology was changing the negative tapes in your head. But since that time, we learned about neural pathways. And you can actually, by not using a certain neural pathway, it withers away, and you can create new ones, like water coming down a mountain to create a new path, right? And in fact, that's what learning is. When you learn a new concept, you're actually creating a neural pathway. And if you go home from the class, you usually forget the concept by the time you get home. How many times have you been to a great sermon and you get home and you say, "Oh, that was so amazing," and somebody says, "What did he say?" Can't remember, right? But that's why you study and you get tested and you practice it again and again. Then the neural pathway gets wired in, and you learn that concept is now part of your understanding. And it's the same with dealing with how you think. So it's a very good. I love your personal strategy.
Yeah, and just a brief explanation of inner child work. I just want to ask, like, does it have to do with hypnotherapy, or, yeah, what does that look like? Just if you can explain a little bit.
When I say inner child work, my favorite. There's a great, very well-known therapist in Germany named Stefania Stahl. She took the understanding of Freud and not Freud, of Jung. He actually brought the idea that led to the concept of inner child. And again, the inner child is just a framework. For me, it's a framework through which we can see, access, and relate with the part of our inner self-identity and the emotional memories that come from that vulnerable and dependent period when we were so affected by what happened to us, and it affected how we feel about ourselves. So there are many ways of relating with the inner child. One of my favorite is a book that's almost impossible to find now, called Recovery of Your Inner Child. It simply takes you on a tour using dominant and non-dominant hands to have dialogues, your adult self with your childhood self. And it's just a technique to allow you to talk with you, to allow your inner feelings to come up, and you recognize things that normally are safely out of your awareness. So there are techniques for that. There are beautiful inner child meditations where someone guides you on a journey to meet your inner child. And you can explore the wounded part of your inner child, the feelings of vulnerability, of loneliness, and of hurts that happened at that time. And you can also, or the angry part of your inner child, because anger is not just something bad or unhealthy. For heaven's sakes, God was angry for a third of the Old Testament. And Jesus was often angry. Jesus never was angry at the weak, the vulnerable, never angry at those who were suffering and struggling and in need. But when he saw people in power who were hurting other people by abusing that power, he got angry. Anger is the fight response. It's part of our stress response to protect myself if I'm being diminished. But there's a healthy way to deal with anger, and there's unhealthy anger as well. And underneath anger is usually hurt and fear, pain and fear. You approach a wounded animal in your backyard, and the animal will turn to you with anger and threat. Stay away. But what's the animal feeling on the inside? Fear and pain. And it's biologically and emotionally similar for human beings. So working with the inner child can be meditations. It can be guided imagery that bring you to an emotional experience. It can be dialogues. And there are a number of other methods. And the book I mentioned is a really good one, written by an art therapist and using artistic expression and left right, dominant and non-dominant hand dialogue, because your dominant hand does, which for most people is the right. It also works if it's the left, but the right hand is connected to the left brain, which is why someone who has a stroke in the left part of their brain, it's the right side of their body that becomes affected, and vice versa. So in the left part of your brain is where linear thinking, logical thinking, measurement, and it's more a representation of reality now. And so it represents the adult self. And when you're dialoguing with your inner child, you use the non-dominant hand, which for most people is directly connected. And I said it's also a useful tool just to allow these things to come up, even if you're left-handed. But it's very powerful that your left hand is connected to the part of your brain that's called the feeling brain, the thinking brain, the feeling brain. And so their memory is all over the place in your brain. There's many parts that contribute to memory, but it's a very powerful way to access emotional memories, this particular technique. And you can learn it from books. You can apply it from books. And I believe some of the people you've had on here run online courses in inner child work as well. And anybody can ask me. I can point them to some good resources. Is that enough of an explanation?
That's great. Yeah, that's really great.
I always use inner child work. I use that book I referred to as a workbook to take a client through to become comfortable at getting in touch with uncomfortable feelings. And there are many people that think, oh, this is so silly. I'm going to write a picture. Oh, come on, that's so stupid. This is like so girly. What are you doing? You know? But often there is a part, and I was like that too, by the way. I couldn't relate to these things. But sometimes that is a resistance and a part of us that doesn't want to get in touch with that part of ourselves. So these things work, and I have experience with dozens and dozens and dozens.
That's really inspiring. It's nice to know that all these tools are out there. So I also have a question. Yeah. So if I am dealing with something, should I tell my kids about it? I mean, I'm not asking if I should tell my spouse, because I think that's pretty obvious that
Yeah.
we should communicate that with our spouse. But yeah.
Let me say something about the kids, and then let me say something about the spouse. Is that okay? The fact is, your kids know. Even if they don't know here, they know here. Your kids feel everything. And in fact, trauma, wounding can take place inside the womb because a child is connected to the emotions of its mother. And if the mother is stressed and overwhelmed and unsupported and broke or whatever, going through, or wasn't expecting to be pregnant, and therefore there's a part that's like, I don't want this. And it's not with intention to reject the child, but the cortisol and adrenaline I talked about cross the placenta. So it's not just a mystical feeling that the child picks up on the emotions of its mother. It's getting the chemical stressors that overactivate that child's stress response. That child will easily be prone to being anxious and will have an attachment style that's anxious. This is also true if you go further back and what's, hereditarily, it can impact that. So it does impact your kids, and they do know. I do family healing sessions because when a client, often parents contact me and please help my child resolve this issue, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, some parents, I'm sorry to say 90% of parents, the attitude is fix my kid and send him back to me so I can love him because now he's the person I want him to be. But the challenge for parents is to love the child you have, even when their values and their choices and their morals and their gender identity, and it's not about making them different so you can love them. They need to feel that you love them as they are. And that means you need to learn how to deal with, despite the fact you have values and beliefs and what you think is best for your child. But unconditional love is, well, from a standpoint, from God's standpoint, is loving us in our sin. And because we feel totally loved, even when we feel shamed and hurt and burdened, we respond. We love God, Scripture says, because He first loved us. So it's important. I'm going back to my original topic because I got lost there a little bit, but your kids know anyway. I was talking about family healing sessions. 90% of parents will approach me with fix my kid and give him back to me fixed, right? And unfortunately, this is not a problem of a child. As many of your listeners know, this is a family system problem. This is something that everybody is involved with, has contributed to, and has work to do. And that wounded young person can be the key for the whole family to come to a new level, to do its work and come to a new level. Now, certain things are not appropriate. You don't share with your 11-year-old about your sexual infidelity with your spouse. But to be able to be honest in an appropriate way, and ancestral skeletons and stuff you went through as a child, it is important to open it up, because your children not only feel it, but they're affected by it anyway. It's impacting them. And so you heal by opening up the infected, gangrenous, smelly, stinky, dark place that's in the darkness. You open it to the light and you open it to the air. You allow it to come out. So a much greater degree of authenticity than most parents are willing or think is important, I recommend. So yes, you should, in an age appropriate way, at the appropriate time, your kids should know your journey, and they should know what you've been through. And I've had many parents in the early days of the church who said, look, my past, I got true parents. I've got a new life. Forget my past. I don't want to deal with it. And that is a recipe for not being emotionally present or available for your own child. That is a recipe. And I've seen it so many times. So yes, be honest. And in terms of my partner, they're involved. And this is another sign that there's trauma, is when you keep secrets, when you have secrets that you can't share. Right. Now, it's not always wise to share everything. Like, I might have a client that has a sexual struggle, and their partner is going to be traumatized by them telling their partner, this is what I've done, this is what I'm doing. And their partner is but they need to be accountable to me. They need to be accountable to someone. And eventually, there are ways of dealing with this, but you don't make excuses for keeping secrets. It's just not correct. I noticed when I worked with your generation as a church leader, I noticed that the tendency of most young people was to feel like I need to share every detail of everything I've been through in my life with my partner, of every mistake I've made. I don't particularly believe that that's always wise or healthy or necessary, but anything that is going on right now, that affects them. That affects your authenticity with them. They deserve to be involved, and if you're hiding that from them. Now, I also think that a good way to approach a healthy marriage, if there are emotional difficulties, either work on them together or work on your own. And sometimes it's very difficult to heal a vertical wound in a horizontal relationship. In other words, to expect my partner to address the hurts and difficulties and reactions that I feel because I'm wounded with my caregivers, my parents. This is better dealt with personal work, me taking care of that stuff, so I bring a healthier, more open, less reactive and sensitive relationship with my partner. But however you approach it, they need to be involved.
Yeah. So, I guess the best way, they need to be involved. Yeah. So how is the best way to involve them? You mentioned a few examples. The person receiving therapy or working through something has maybe an accountability partner if they have a therapist, or they're going through the work. Yeah. What if my partner is the one working on something? Like, how can I best support them through that?
It's really, of course, there are case-by-case issues to consider. To clarify in terms of them being involved, if I'm dealing with a personal wound or a compulsive behavior that is a source of shame or and will be something dramatic and shameful to others, it's not necessarily the right first step to share it with my partner. But it is the wrong step to try and keep it a secret and feel like I can just tough it out or feel like I can live an authentic life with a dirty secret. That's just not the approach. It's better to approach it with someone that I can be accountable to, either in therapy or religiously or both. Let me tell a little side story. When I first was involved with working with the Blessed Family Department, all I knew was spiritual solutions. So when a young person was struggling with a difficulty that was considered unprincipled by the church and the standards, then all I knew how to do was have them confess. Right? Just confess, tell the truth, get it out in the open, which is healthy and good. I didn't spread that to anybody, judge them. No, it's healthy and good. But then I began to work with someone, actually Mrs. Debbie Gullery, and she said to me, "What the heck are you doing?" She said, you're just taking confession. What about follow-up? What about helping them? What about providing resources? What about working with them, giving them answers?" It just opened up a whole new world for me. So I've come a long way, I hope. So it's not necessarily the appropriate thing to dump it on your partner, but don't use that as an excuse for not dealing with it. And as a partner, if you know your partner is dealing with something specific, and of course, being supportive, being encouraging, being patient. It's not always easy because sometimes that stuff is triggering my stuff and I'm reacting to it or angry at my partner. And then I've got to deal with the anger. And maybe I need help to deal with the anger. I've also seen situations, just as an example, where there's an unhealthy partnership and one partner is either controlling, critical, never satisfied, making, not responsive and actually suppressing or disempowering the other. Now, that other person, this is just an isolated example, that other person might make the decision or might succumb to the temptation to comfort themselves with unhealthy behavior, compulsive behavior, sexual behavior, or an unfaithful relationship. All of these are devastating and important, and there's no excuse for that behavior. But I have seen situations where then this part that you can't tell someone that's been betrayed that, well, it's your problem too. It's the problem of the relationship. No, that person, that's a trauma, right? That's a trauma, and you can't make that person feel responsible. But ultimately, I have had people come to me and say, it was the most hurtful thing that I ever experienced that my spouse was unfaithful. And I now consider it the best thing that ever happened to our marriage because it woke us up. And like I said, you can't say that to someone or push them to that point. But I have seen people who have controlled the relationship and that other person made a weak, unwise choice to comfort themselves. And this person now wants to use that to keep their control. You did this to me. You did. So there's also, and there are professional, well-established support groups for how to deal with infidelity for the betraying spouse and for the betrayed spouse, because there is a process to allow these things to heal. And like a broken bone, if you do it well, it can heal more strong than it was before the break. Does that address anything you asked me?
Yeah, sure. Don't. Yeah, done. Yeah, that was really great. And so one other thing I want to ask, how can I do my best to prevent passing on this trauma to my kids, especially negativity or fear in the area of sex, if something happened in my life?
Well, it's generally comes under the same rules and rubric that I've been sharing throughout, the same healthy suggestions dealing with that stuff. Now, sexuality is so connected to love and to our self-identity, and it's love, life, and legacy, right? Lineage. It's so deeply connected to who we are and how we feel about ourselves that our own painful experiences. Unfortunately, the purity culture represented, which is now everybody's against it and everybody's challenging it. It was hurtful, and it doesn't easily apply to a culture where people are planning to get married in their 30s and to try and live their life and have experiences before that. Still, I do believe, as we are taught, that the way we're biologically wired, and we have the tendency to get infatuated when we get close to someone, is best designed to cement us into a lasting relationship with one person. I still believe we're designed that way, for sure. And yet, the unfortunate byproduct of that kind of standard can be a lot of shame around sexuality. And unfortunately, although I don't believe I ever taught that way, I certainly never intended to convey that way. But even, just the feeling like if I have feelings toward the opposite sex, I'm evil, I'm wrong, I'm shameful, I'm doing the wrong thing, I'm ungodly, and not being able to deal with these things in a healthy way, in a compassionate and loving way. So if a parent's ability to be comprehensive, patient, compassionate, and curious, very, very important to be compassionate and curious instead of reactive and judgmental. If that's affected by my own past experiences, then working on that stuff. If I've had a traumatic experience, if I've had a reason to feel shame, and of course there is a lot of shame around sexuality, and the culture blames religion for having created that shame. We have a deeper understanding that the shame is actually more deep. The shame comes from what sexuality became as compared to what it's meant to be. That's a very high standard. And many young people grow up and feel like that's unreachable. I'm going to buy what the world is selling. Many young people who grow up in the unification faith are persuaded by the culture and conclude that that standard was unrealistic. That standard is unattainable and it can't be lived. But as a parent, the same principles apply. Working, processing my own stuff, resolving, being honest and authentic and open about these things is the best way. And any other specific question, I would prefer to deal with it, case by case. I hope that helps. It's been an awful lot today.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we should try to wrap this up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, say as a parent, I notice something in my child that maybe is mirroring something, some sort of trauma reaction, and then I see my child is reacting in the same way. I mean, yeah, is it then enough to work on myself when I see already my child has already inherited this kind of behavior? I mean, you
It's
did mention family therapy, and I think that maybe is one answer.
Thank you for bringing this up because I have a strong recommended resource. It's great if you have a chance to resolve as much of your own difficulties prior to having children. It's another thing if you're in the midst of watching your children grow up and struggle and go through difficulties. And I believe that is the pain that God refers to that will be the result of the fall, the pain of bearing children that God says to Eve that she's going to experience. I don't believe that that's labor pain because that's a matter of physics. That's not a matter of the fall. Right? That's the head is bigger than the vaginal opening. But the pain, we all know, everyone as a parent in a fallen world knows the pain of my own realizing, and that's actually God's pain as well. The reason that he has worked so hard, and I asked this, I struggled with this question. Wait a minute, this was all set up unfairly, portion of responsibility, power of love, all these things, that's all nice, but it wasn't this, and God told me, of course, as a parent, I feel responsible. And that's why I've never stopped investing in trying to save and heal and restore my children, right? That's the answer I got when I prayed about the fact that it wasn't fair what happened, that it doesn't, the theology doesn't explain what was hurting my heart about the suffering of humanity. Got to get back to my original thought once again. A resource, once your children, when you begin to see the challenges and difficulties and struggles of your children, I strongly recommend this resource. I think it's the best form of best approach to couples therapy, and it's the best approach to parenting. And you've probably heard of it, Real Love. Real Love. And there is an entire website, Real Love in Parenting. And there are gateway videos. Your kid is addicted to video games. Your kid is slamming the door and disobeying. Your kid, any single thing you're experiencing, click on this, hear a 5 or 10-minute video that will direct you toward how you can begin to adjust the relationship dynamics in your family in a healthy way. And for couples, a Real Love is super powerful because we were taught, live for the sake of others. I heard that over and over again from the greatest spiritual teacher in my life. But how to put legs on that when your partner is angry at you or when you're going through a fight? How can you love unconditionally? Real Love teaches you how to practice an unconditional way of loving partner, kids, and others, even though you are flawed and limited as a person. It's super powerful, and it's a great resource for parenting. So reallove.com. I have no financial interest. Real Love in Parenting. And there are books to read and there are courses to take and there's coaching to receive. And I use that in my practice all the time. It's a great way. So my first answer, when you are seeing that there's already an unhealthy dynamic in the family, everybody's negative. Kids are always complaining. Kids don't do, I ask them over and over and over again and they don't do. Those are not just procedural issues. There are emotional roots and reasons for all of it. And Real Love helps you see those things and understand the adjustments you can make in order to address that. I love it as a resource. So yeah, it's not enough just to work on yourself when your kids are already dealing with issues.
Thanks for sharing that.
There's one other great resource. When I talk about family therapy, there is a weekend program called a family healing session that takes place from a Friday night to a Sunday afternoon that is worth 6 months to a year of therapy for each family member involved. It's a safe, supportive, and guided protocol that allows all of the accumulated hurts, resentments, and garbage to be flushed, right? In a safe way. Anger doesn't take over because the facilitators, of which I am one, there are other people who can do this as well. And this technique was developed working with autistic children and then modified and developed to reattach, to bring healthy attachment in relationships that are already difficult. And one weekend, it doesn't solve the problems forever. It creates a total reset and a chance to sow healthy behaviors in the family. This is another resource that I would recommend.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Yeah. So how can one know if they have fully recovered? Is there this feeling that, yes, I feel good, or do you think these things, they can come back always?
Well, I'm 70 years old, and a couple months ago, I did a amazing men's retreat to deal with my fundamental childhood wounds once again. I dealt with them in my religious life. I healed the wounds of my parents that I had with my caregivers, whom I love and appreciate, but I healed those wounds because I had an unconditional God, but I also had substantial true parents, but that's also very distant and projected. Who they are is a projection of me. Oh, they do this amazing, they sing better than anybody else, they do all these perfect things. But then I also had mentors, specific people in my life that I replaced that missed developmental need. So I dealt with it then. I dealt with it later in life. And a couple months ago, I wept, I challenged, I overcame, I released a lot more. It's a lifetime journey, right? And I'm not saying you have to be doing what I'm doing when you're 70, but it's a lifetime journey. But I remember the time when, as an insecure young person, I started to realize change. And my immediate response was, how come it took me so long? Why am I so behind everybody else? What's wrong with me? Why, and you continue to live authentically and openly and do the work. And your perspective of life, your feeling about yourself, your sense of confidence, knowing who you are, how you want to live, where you go, and then looking back, even though life had suffering in the past. Father said, I look back and it was all love, right? The Bible says that God will restore to you all the years that the locusts have eaten, all the times that you felt frustrated about, and wasted and lost. It'll all be given back to you when you heal. So it's a lifetime process, and you'll feel it bit by bit by bit by bit. My tendency was always to feel, I did it, I'm done, I'm healed, I'm better, and then I run. It's like a stairway rather than a ramp, I'd run at this new level and think I could do everything, and I was healed and I was whole. Then I'd run smack dab into the next step, right? Then I have to go back to work and come to the next level and come to the next level. So I think it's like that. But you'll know, you'll feel the changes, and living authentically is a very important thing, because authenticity is what we sacrifice when we're desperate to stay attached, when we're desperate to be loved and affirmed. I became the classic pleaser. And as I often said in my testimony, long before I knew any of this stuff, I said my first 10 years of being such a faithful, able type church member was basically pleasing my leaders and dancing for God. That's where I was emotional at that stage. But it was part of the journey. It was part of the journey.
Yeah, I think it keeps us on our toes and just embracing this whole process as a growth journey.
Well, obviously, any of the areas we've talked about tonight deserves, a podcast to go into. There's so many podcasts that could be developed from this, and I hope people are motivated to look deeper, go deeper, ask questions, and I hope it's useful.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, this was inspired by a question from one of our listeners, and I really hope it was a really honorable question, right? It's like, how do I process my trauma so I can do it better for my kids? And so I really support all of us, because I think we're all a little bit broken in some way. Just like you said, this unconditional love has not truly existed in a family the way God wished it to. And so that's what we're doing. We're just getting better and better at translating this unconditional love to our children. I think you shared a lot of useful wisdom today. So thank you so much.
Hope so.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Hope it's useful. And be sure to take my email and make it available. So if anybody has questions or wants to learn more or wants to get connected to resources or wants individual work, or I can point them in another direction, that they have a way to reach me. Okay. And of course, I work pretty closely with High Noon, so I'm reachable through High Noon in general.
Yeah, perfect. We'll include your email address in the notes to this podcast.
God bless.
All right. Thank you so much. Play it, pause it, post it, click it, and share it.